The one strong feeling that I had, which surprised even me, was that a very strong sense that if artists were ever needed, now was the time.
From the 9/11 Memorial Museum, this is Our City, Our Story, a series where New Yorkers talk about their city and how September 11th changed that. I'm Will Thwaites. Artist Eric Fischl is known for his bold paintings depicting scenes from suburban America. His work is often thought of as voyeuristic. As a viewer, you are frequently put in the position of catching someone in a private moment. In 2001, he created a sculpture in response to the 9/11 attacks. It's a female figure, caught in motion as she fell from the towers. He calls it Tumbling Woman. The piece was initially controversial, but over a decade after its creation, it was shown at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in a special exhibition called Rendering the Unthinkable: Artists Respond to 9/11. More on that later in the episode. Fischl was born in New York City and grew up on Long Island, in the suburbs of Port Washington. He wasn't particularly drawn to art as a child and didn't come around to it until his late 20s. He talked about this in the studio with my co-host, Jenny Pachuki, who you'll hear ask questions throughout the episode. Here's Jenny chatting with Fischl about his passion for art.
How did it come to you?
It came to me by accident. Or divine intervention, one or the other. I actually had gone back when I was 20 to stay with my parents in Phoenix because I had gotten into some trouble with drugs and stuff like that, and this was the 60s, so I tried my alternate lifestyle kind of thing, youth rebellion, all of that. I was not a very good hippie. And,
you failed at being a hippie.
I failed at being a hippie, which was, caused me great chagrin for a while. But anyway, I went back to kind of straighten my life out a bit. And I had a job delivering lawn furniture in Phoenix. And there was a guy working there who was about my age who was taking art classes at a junior college, a community college. And we talked about art and argued about art, and his idea of art was gluing pieces of bread onto window panes, and my idea of art was like Rembrandt or something, so we'd argue what art was. And then at some point I thought, well, if he can glue bread onto a window pane, I could glue it onto something else if that's art. And I thought, I'll go take art classes, because if you are not good at art, you get a C. I mean, you don't fail art, right?
Right.
So
it's a safe bet.
It's a safe bet. And I thought it'd be a good place to meet girls, and so that's what I did. And then I found something that I didn't know I would find. Two things, actually. I found that I didn't know I would find, and that convinced me that even if I was a lousy artist, I should do this the rest of my life. And that was that it was the first time in my life I could concentrate, and it was also the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of being alone. And those two things made me feel so integrated that I thought, even if I suck, I'm going to do this.
Fischl was developing this passion for art, and so he decided to turn that passion into a career. He didn't think that New York City was the right place for him at the time, so he traveled around for a while, until ultimately he made the decision to move to Manhattan, a decision he fought against for a bit. Here's my co-host Jenny Pachuki again.
How did New York ultimately win the arm wrestling match?
Yeah. Well, if you wake up every day saying, I don't need to go to New York to be the artist I want to be, you need to go to New York. Because there's something about it that is saying, no, New York is the test. It's the big leagues. It's the thing you really are pitting yourself against and trying to live up to. And so go see what you can do. So
when did you ultimately get here?
My wife, April Gornick, and I moved here in 1978.
And where did you live when you first got here?
We lived on, rented a loft on 20th Street between 7th and 8th for a year, and then moved down to Tribeca to Reed Street for several years before our landlord burned us out.
How was it for you finding a community in the art world at that time? People tend now to look back on the late 70s, early 80s as a really romantic time in New York City history. And I guess it was, particularly if you had a connection to that art scene. But I also know that the tendency to romanticize a time after it's passed is you see it through different lens. What do you remember about it?
Well, first of all, New York in the 70s was terrifying. And it was, a huge crime rate. There was you lived in a constant state of uncertainty. It was, the city was just struggling terribly. But the community of artists was vibrant. Soho was a real village. You would walk down the street seeing people that you knew, that you liked, that you didn't like, that you were competitive with, that you partied with. There was a sense of vitality in just the exchanges that were taking place. Everything was about art in a way that was not connected to commerce, and it was connected to the sort of the deeper meanings of committing a life to art and the purpose of art and culture and civilization. And so it was very heady in that way, and it was experimental, and it was argumentative, and there was, at that time, the mid-70s moving forward was a thing where the floodgates had bust open. New York had been very, in terms of the art world, had, after the war and after the rise of abstract expressionism, where all of a sudden America became the dominant art driver, it closed out a lot of stuff, closed out Europe, was no longer interested in what was going on in Europe, was looking at itself. It was very exciting. I don't think you can mythologize it too much, frankly. It was a great time, and it was something that, it was self-created. The artists moved to Soho because it was cheap, and there were spaces that they could work in for the kind of work they were doing. There was an authenticity to why it was there. It wasn't a contrivance of a real estate market that was looking to gentrify something using artists as a way of doing it, which is what it is now. So,
by the year 2000, Fischl had transitioned to working primarily out of his studio in Sag Harbor, Long Island. He said that being there eventually became more stimulating than being in New York City. Fischl was at that Long Island studio on September 11th.
That morning I went out. I was taking a walk in the woods early. And I came back, and April said that I should turn on the TV set, that something's happened downtown, that it looks like a plane has hit one of the trade towers. So I turned on the TV and then saw what everybody else saw throughout the course of the day.
Shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story.
Frozen, terrified, riveted, in a state of just, complete disbelief that this was happening. So.
How did you process the emotions of this tragedy?
The one strong feeling that I had, which surprised even me, was that a very strong sense that if artists were ever needed, now was the time. That what And the reason I felt that was that what the artist is gifted at is putting order to chaos and giving it form, giving it a language, giving it an image, giving it something that ultimately we can all share. And it's the sharing that's the important thing, that we need to connect and stay connected. And, I'm sure everybody wanted to figure out a way to help. And I believe that the way that you help best is you come with your strength. And so for me, my strength is being an artist and somebody that can picture people, especially. So that's what I set out to do, was try to figure out how to articulate that.
And the result of this is the Tumbling Woman sculpture. How did you come to this idea? And what was your process specifically with is it odd to call it a her? Or should I call it an it?
No, call it her. I think of
Okay.
her tumbling woman. So
Yeah,
yeah,
her. I
yeah.
mean, I don't know if art is gender. I don't. Anyway, her. She's a her to me.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come to her?
I came to her over about a 6-month period of trying to sort of let the experience settle in certain ways and see what would come to the surface. First of all, there were two very clear things that were part of the 9/11 experience. One was that 3,000 people died and there were no bodies. That makes it very hard to process loss. It's a disappearance on some level rather than a death. And so closure is very hard. For me, the greatest sense of loss was that 3,000 people were murdered on that day, and I wanted to remember that. The other thing that was such a profound, iconic, and terrifying memory was that people jumped or fell to their death, and that was so horrible as to be aware of it, to have witnessed it or to be aware of it was so terrifying, because it clearly showed us that people would have chosen one form of certain death over another form of certain death, that there was no escape. And that drove home just how horrible those last moments were for the people that died. And it was something that, even though the media censored the imagery immediately, I mean, it didn't go half a day before, they stopped showing it and those images disappeared. Everyone who saw them or heard about them, it was burned on the brain. That was the way that we understood the horror of that. Anyway, so there was all this stuff that was going on. So I started thinking about being off balance. And an image of tumbleweed came to mind. This sort of seeing this tumbleweed blowing down a deserted street, dusty street, attaching itself to a fence post here and then blowing a little later, blowing someplace else. And, it felt like that's the country right now. It's in that state of tumbleweed. So the idea of tumbling was there. And then, of course, it was like combining tumbling with falling, because falling was such an iconic memory of that 9/11. And I felt it absolutely necessary to make it a person, a body, because I wanted the body to be remembered, that's what this thing is all about. It's not about architecture, it's about the body, about people. So that's how Tumbling Woman came about.
Tumbling Woman was unveiled on the first anniversary of the attacks. It was placed in the middle of a crowded Rockefeller Center plaza, without a sign to explain the meaning of the sculpture to New Yorkers who still felt the raw emotion of that day. The piece that Fischl had intended to aid the public grieving process instead caused public outrage, and it was removed shortly after. He walked my co-host Jenny Pachuki through what happened.
I assumed wrongly, but I assumed that if I could face this, somebody else could as well, and that if I could go through the process of grieving and stay with the object that's creating that or generating that, that memory, then somebody else could as well. And then that's what a memorial is. That's what, they're memory devices to keep us connected to the tragedy. So I felt that, not that it would be easy, but that people would be willing to do that, because we need to share publicly, to grieve publicly. We need to go through that process, and we need to ultimately come to realize that we are the ones who survived it, and that our life is going to be, the quality of our lives will be determined by how we move forward. So that was my sense of certainty that that was the right thing to do.
But that was why we selected it, and why it was on view, and all of these things that you talked about are happening, or we've created the space for them to happen. Mm-hmm. But like you were saying about timing, can you talk about the first place that she was displayed, and how the sense of New York and collective grief and the grieving process kind of interfered with her being received the way you would have hoped?
Yeah, I worked to have the piece finished in time for the first anniversary. And it was, my desire was to participate in the public grieving process that, through, the memory grieving process that is our 9/11 ritual. And I had asked my dealer, Mary Boone, at that time if she could find a public space for it, because I've felt that I wanted it to be outside of the art environment, that this wasn't about art in any sort of the museum way or the gallery way. This was about art shared by the community in a public way, as part of the public, ritual of grief and memory. And so she found space at Rockefeller Center, in the concourse at Rockefeller Center, and we put it there. And so the morning of the first anniversary, 9/11, all of a sudden there's Tumbling Woman sitting in the middle of the concourse, and it hadn't been announced or whatever, it just showed up. It was, the placement of it was ironic, not planned by me or anything like that, but had this kind of, I thought, compelling irony to it, which was it was against the wall inside the concourse. On the other side of the wall, on the outside skating rink, was the sculpture of Prometheus, who was the bringer of fire to us, to Earth and stuff. So you had this sort of flying and falling thing happening on either side of the wall. Again, the light and the dark and stuff. So it seemed poetic, but it wasn't received on any of those levels. It was I had been interviewed by someone at the New York Observer, and made a case about it. They ran a very nice article about the piece. I left for a pre-planned trip to Europe, and by the time I got there, I was getting phone calls that they were going to remove the sculpture because it had created such a firestorm of anger and hostility, and that the people at Rockefeller Center were being threatened with bombing and stuff like that. I mean, it was like the hysteria of 9/11 erupted right there. It was such a shock, and such a profound misinterpretation of my intention, my sincerity. So,
was it painful for you?
It was profoundly painful. Yeah. I think the one thing nobody likes, and certainly no artist likes, because they spend their lives trying to become clearer and clearer about what they're feeling and meaning. To be misunderstood is like the worst thing that could happen. Yeah.
What was it like when you saw her on view in the museum when the show opened?
I cried. I just was deeply moved. I felt a certain kind of reward for my belief in the significance of the piece in relation to the profound significance of the event. So it felt like I saw her at home, and I was overcome with that.
Closure?
I think so, yeah.
The story of Tumbling Woman is the story of our collective grief. Fischl created her out of a desire to bring people together after 9/11. Maybe it wasn't his intention, but her long story shows how time and place are crucial for healing and for coming around to processing what happened on our own terms, in a safe space. From the 9/11 Memorial Museum, this is Our City, Our Story. I'm Will Thwaites. I host and produce the show alongside Jenny Pachuki. This episode was also produced by Elizabeth Bistro and was written by Jenny Pachuki. Our executive producers are Carl Cricco and Michael Frazier. Sound editing is done by Sam Behrens. To stay connected to the show, subscribe to Our City, Our Story, wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more information, visit our website, 911memorial.org.